Hello there, and welcome to Factonium Facts Unlocked. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, to let the day settle behind you like dust on ancient stone. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet room where evening has finally arrived. A corner of your home where you can finally rest. Tonight we're going to explore the Minoans, a civilization that flourished on the island of Crete nearly 4,000 years ago. We'll walk through palace corridors that were already ancient when Homer sang of them, discover frescoes that still glow with impossible colour, and contemplate a people who built without walls in an age of warfare. It's a journey that takes us to the very dawn of European civilization, to a culture so sophisticated that when archaeologists first uncovered it, they could scarcely believe what they'd found. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a dry recitation of dates and pottery shards. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through palace rooms and workshops, through harbours and ceremonies, taking our time with each discovery. By the end, I think you'll find yourself changed by the encounter with these remarkable people, by their art and their architecture, their mysteries and their grace. If you enjoy these calm explorations of lost worlds, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here with me tonight. So settle in, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, and let it out even more slowly. And let's begin our slow drift through the palaces of ancient Crete. There's nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to do, just listen, and let the story unfold like a scroll that's been waiting thousands of years to be read. Long before there were palaces, before there were frescoes of dolphins leaping in azure seas or ceremonies in torchlit courtyards, there was simply the island itself. Crete rises from the Mediterranean like a mountain range that decided to anchor itself between three continents, between Europe and Africa and Asia. The island is long and narrow, running east to west for nearly 160 miles. Its spine a series of peaks that catch the morning sun while the valleys still sleep in shadow. The first people who made this island their home arrived perhaps as early as 7000 BCE, sailing from somewhere to the east with seeds and livestock, and the courage required to cross open water to an unknown shore. They were Neolithic farmers, and they settled in caves at first, then built simple villages of mud brick and stone. For thousands of years they lived quietly, growing wheat and barley, tending goats and sheep, making pottery that grew steadily more refined as the centuries passed. But around 3000 BCE, something began to shift. The villages grew larger, the pottery became more sophisticated, trade networks expanded, reaching out across the sea to Egypt and the Levant and mainland Greece. Metalworking arrived, first copper, then bronze, that revolutionary alloy of copper and tin that would give its name to an entire age. This was the foundation period, what archaeologists call the early Minoan period, though of course the people living through it didn't know they were Minoans at all. That name would come much later, borrowed from Greek mythology, from King Minos and his labyrinth, and the creature that dwelled within. The people themselves, if they had a name for their culture, have kept it locked in their undeciphered script. In those clay tablets inscribed with linear A that still resist all our attempts to read them. What we can see in the archaeological record is a society growing increasingly complex. Craft specialization emerges. Some people work only clay, others only metal. Trade becomes more organized. Ships grow larger, capable of longer voyages, carrying olive oil and wool and finished goods to distant markets. Social hierarchies develop, visible in burial goods, in the size and elaboration of houses, in the first hints of what would become the palatial system. Around 2000 BCE, something remarkable happened. Across Crete, at sites that had been important settlements for centuries, people began to build. Not simple houses or village workshops, but structures on an entirely different scale. Massive complexes with hundreds of rooms, multiple stories, sophisticated drainage systems, storage magazines that could hold enough olive oil and grain to feed thousands. The first palaces rose from Cretan soil at Knossos and Phaistos and Malia and Zakros, and with them a civilization unlike anything the Mediterranean world had seen before. And this moment when ambition crystallized into architecture, when accumulated wealth and social organization reached a critical mass and transformed into something entirely new. This is where our story truly begins. Let's walk together through the main entrance of Knossos Palace, through what archaeologists call the North Entrance, on a morning in, let's say, 1600 BCE. The palace has stood here for centuries already, been rebuilt after earthquakes, expanded as the dynasty grew in power and ambition. You're approaching from the harbour road, and the first thing you notice is the sheer scale of it, rising in terraces up the hillside. Painted columns thick as tree trunks in crimson and black. The palace at Knossos covered roughly 150,000 square feet, more than 3 acres of interconnected rooms and courtyards and corridors that wind and split and rise and descend in ways that can still confuse visitors today. Some archaeologists estimate it contained over 1,000 rooms, though that number includes storerooms and workshops and corridors too small to properly call chambers. It's easy to see how legends of a labyrinth might have emerged from such a place. At the heart of everything lies the central court, a vast rectangular space open to the sky, measuring roughly 180 feet long and 90 feet wide. Every major wing of the palace connects to this courtyard, and it served, we believe, as the stage for religious ceremonies, for bull-leaping displays, for gatherings of the entire community on significant occasions. The court is oriented precisely north-south, aligned with such accuracy that it suggests sophisticated surveying techniques, an understanding of astronomy, a concern for cosmic order expressed in architecture. The western wing holds the ceremonial and administrative heart of the palace. Here you find what Sir Arthur Evans called the throne room. Though whether the figure who sat on that alabaster chair was truly a king, in the way we understand the term remains uncertain. The throne still sits there today, flanked by frescoes of griffins, mythical creatures with eagle heads and lion bodies. The room is small, intimate, and adjacent is a lustral basin, a sunken area reached by steps, clearly intended for ritual purification. The residential quarters occupy the eastern wing, descending the slope in multiple terraces. The so-called Queen's Megaron features some of the palace's most beautiful frescoes, including the famous dolphins that seem to swim across the walls in an eternal blue-green sea. These private apartments had running water, sophisticated toilets with flushing systems, light wells that brought sunshine deep into the interior, and a ventilation system that kept the rooms comfortable, even in the heat of Mediterranean summer. The magazines. The storage areas dominate much of the ground floor of the western wing. Long corridors lined with massive clay jars, pithoi, some tall enough for a person to stand inside. These vessels held olive oil primarily, the liquid wealth of ancient Crete, but also wine and grain and honey. The palace at Knossos could store enough food to sustain thousands of people through months of siege or famine, though interestingly there's no evidence they ever needed to. The Minoans, uniquely among Bronze Age civilizations, built their palaces without fortification walls. This combination of administrative function, religious significance, residential comfort, and economic storage all under one roof, all integrated into a single sprawling complex. This is what defines the Minoan palace. It wasn't just a home for royalty, or just a temple, or just a warehouse. It was all of these at once, the beating heart of a complex society, the centre around which an entire culture organised itself. And Knossos was merely the largest of such centres, which brings us naturally to the other palaces scattered across Crete, each distinct, yet all sharing this same essential character. While Knossos may have been first among equals, it was never alone. Across Crete, Other palaces rose in the same period, creating a network of ceremonial and economic centres that gave shape to Minoan society. Each palace ruled over its own region, commanded its own port, maintained its own workshops and storerooms, and yet all shared enough architectural and cultural features to suggest they were part of a unified civilization, perhaps even a unified political entity. Phaistos stands on a hilltop in southern Crete, overlooking the Messara plain, the island's most fertile agricultural region. The palace here is smaller than Knossos, but in some ways more elegant, its proportions more refined, its integration with the landscape more harmonious. From the main courtyard, you can see south to the Libyan Sea, north to Mount Ida, the highest peak on Crete, where caves held religious significance for centuries. The palace at Phaistos followed the same basic plan as Knossos, with central courtyard, western ceremonial wing, eastern residential quarters, and storage magazines. But here, the architects seem to have paid special attention to views, to the way sunlight enters rooms at different times of day, to the relationship between built space and natural setting. Malia sits on the north coast, about 25 miles east of Knossos. Its palace is unique in several ways. First, it's built on flat ground rather than a hillside, which gives it a more regular geometric plan. Second, it features an unusual structure called the Knossos stone, a circular altar with 34 small hollows around its rim, likely used for liquid offerings. Third, Malia's palace seems to have been more focused on craft production than the others. Excavations have revealed extensive workshops for metalworking, stone carving, and ceramic production. This was perhaps the industrial heart of Minoan Crete, where skilled craftspeople created the luxury goods that were traded across the Mediterranean. Zakros lies on the far eastern coast of Crete, the most remote of the four great palaces. It was the last to be excavated, not fully revealed until the 1960s, and its distance from modern development meant it was found in remarkable condition. Zakros served as Crete's gateway to the east, to Cyprus and the Levantine coast, to Egypt. Its harbour could accommodate large merchant vessels, and its storerooms contained materials that came from hundreds of miles away. Elephant tusks from Syria, ostrich eggs from Libya, copper ingots from Cyprus, all found their way to Zakros. The palace here feels more like a fortified trading post than a ceremonial centre, though it possessed all the standard features of Minoan palatial architecture. What's remarkable about these palaces is not just their individual characteristics, but their simultaneous development. They all emerged around 2000 BCE, all reached their greatest elaboration around 1600 BCE, and all met their ends within a relatively short period in the mid-second millennium. This synchronization suggests centralized planning, cultural unity, perhaps even a single political authority that manifested itself through multiple regional centres. The palaces were connected by road networks, not Roman roads certainly, but paved paths wide enough for carts, marked with milestones, maintained across generations. Messages could travel from Knossos to Zakros in perhaps 2 days. Goods moved along these routes constantly: olive oil from the western plains, wine from the central valleys, timber from the mountain slopes, finished goods from palace workshops to ports and markets. And binding this network together, beyond roads and trade and shared architectural traditions, was something more fundamental: a common language, a common religion, a common artistic vision. Which leads us to consider what united these palace cultures at the deepest level, what made someone from Zakros and someone from Phaistos both recognisably Minoan. In museum cases across Crete, in archaeological storerooms and research institutes, thousands of clay tablets wait. They're small, most no larger than your palm, inscribed with neat rows of symbols, pressed into wet clay and then fired, accidentally preserved when the buildings that housed them burned. These are the administrative records of the Minoan palaces, inventories and accounts and lists, the bureaucratic foundation of a complex society. And we cannot read them. The script used by the Minoans is called Linear A by archaeologists. to distinguish it from a later script, Linear B, which was used by the Mycenaean Greeks who came to dominate Crete after the Minoan decline. Linear B was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, a brilliant piece of code breaking that revealed it to be an early form of Greek. But Linear A remains opaque, stubbornly resistant to all attempts at decipherment. We know certain things about Linear A. We know it's a syllabic script, where each symbol represents a syllable, rather than a single sound or an entire word. We know it includes about 90 distinct signs, plus a set of logograms, symbols that represent whole words or concepts. We know it was used primarily for economic record keeping, though a few religious inscriptions have been found. We know it was written from left to right, with occasional right-to-left exceptions in what might be monumental inscriptions. What we don't know is what language it records. Is it related to any known language family? Is it an Indo-European language, like Greek or Sanskrit or Latin? Is it a Semitic language, related to Hebrew or Phoenician? Or is it something entirely isolated, a language with no living descendants, no close relatives, a linguistic island in the Mediterranean? Without more extensive texts, without a bilingual inscription like the Rosetta Stone. We may never know for certain. Some tablets are clearer than others in their general meaning, even if we can't read the actual words. A tablet showing rows of symbols for sheep, followed by numbers, is obviously a livestock inventory. A tablet with symbols for jars and measures is recording stored goods. A tablet with personal names, we can identify these by their structure and repetition, and numbers might be a labour roster or tribute record. The bureaucratic logic of accounting transcends language barriers. What's tantalising is how much we're missing. Every palace had its archives. Thousands of tablets have been recovered, but these represent only a fraction of what once existed, only those that were accidentally fired when buildings burned. Countless tablets simply dried in the sun, dissolved back into mud over the millennia. The complete administrative records of a civilization that lasted for over 500 years, have vanished, leaving us only these fragmentary glimpses. Imagine if we could read them. We would know the names of the rulers, the titles they held, how power was structured and transmitted. We would understand the details of their economy, what goods were most valued, how trade was organised, what taxes or tribute were collected. We would know their religious practices in far greater detail, the names of their gods, the nature of their rituals. We would possibly even find literature, poetry, stories, the voices of individual Minoans speaking across 3,000 years. But perhaps there's something fitting in the mystery. The Minoans speak to us through their art and architecture, through the physical traces of their lives, through objects and images and the bones of their civilization. Their words remain locked, private, untranslatable. They show us what they built and how they lived, but their innermost thoughts, their own understanding of themselves, stays veiled behind symbols we cannot penetrate, and yet we can learn much from what they chose to depict in their art, from the images they painted on their palace walls and carved into their seal stones and moulded in clay. These visual records may be more revealing in some ways than any written archive, which brings us to the extraordinary artistic achievements that make Minoan civilization so immediately recognisable, so distinctive among Bronze Age cultures. Walk through the ruins of Knossos today, carefully restored and partially reconstructed by Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, and you're immediately struck by colour. Crimson columns against white walls, blue paint on ceiling beams, and everywhere frescoes, fragments of frescoes, images that were painted on wet plaster nearly 4,000 years ago, and that somehow, impossibly, retain their vividness. The Minoans were exceptional painters. This simple fact deserves emphasis because it's easy, when looking at ancient art, to focus on technique and composition, and miss the fundamental skill required. These artists understood pigments, knew how to prepare surfaces, mastered the difficult technique of true fresco, where paint is applied to wet plaster and becomes chemically bonded to the wall as it dries. They could render human figures in motion, capture the sinuous leap of a dolphin, convey the weight and presence of a bull. All with brushes and natural pigments and no room for error once the brush touched the wall. Their colour palette was surprisingly sophisticated. They used red ochre and yellow ochre, both iron-based pigments found in Cretan soil. They had white from limestone, black from charcoal. But their blues are particularly remarkable, derived from a synthetic pigment called Egyptian blue, made by heating together silica, calcium, and copper compounds. This wasn't a natural mineral but a manufactured colour, requiring specific knowledge and controlled firing temperatures. The Minoans imported this technology from Egypt or perhaps Cyprus, then made it their own. The subjects they chose to paint reveal a civilization in love with nature and movement. There are no battle scenes in Minoan art, no conquered enemies, no graphic depictions of violence. Instead, we see dolphins arcing through painted seas, birds perched on rocky outcrops, lilies and crocuses and papyrus plants rendered with botanical accuracy. We see young people, male and female, athletic and elegant, engaged in ritual or celebration or procession. We see bulls, again and again, those massive powerful animals that clearly held deep significance in Minoan religion and culture. One of the most famous frescoes, called the Prince of the Lilies, shows a crowned figure walking through a field of flowers, one arm raised, head held high. The original is fragmentary, and Evans' restoration has been questioned, but even in pieces the grace of the composition is evident. The figure moves through a world of abundance and beauty, a world where nature and culture interweave seamlessly. Another remarkable fresco from a house in Akrotiri on the island of Thera, rather than from Crete proper but clearly Minoan in style, depicts an entire room as though the walls had disappeared. You're looking out at a garden, at papyrus and lilies and crocuses, at swallows swooping through the air, at rocks and earth and sky. It's an astonishing feat of spatial illusion, turning architecture into landscape, making interior space feel infinite. The bull-leaping frescoes deserve special attention. They show a sport or ritual in which young athletes, both male and female, we can tell by the artistic convention of painting men in red-brown and women in white, grasp the horns of a charging bull, vault over its back, and land behind it. Whether this was actual practice or mythological representation remains debated, but the dynamism of the images is undeniable. The human figures are caught mid-motion, bodies arched, impossibly graceful in the face of the bull's power. What unites all these frescoes is a sense of joy in the physical world, a celebration of movement and colour and life. There's no ponderous monumentality here, no stern religious didacticism. Even in religious scenes, and surely much of this art had religious significance, there's a lightness, a delight, an embracing of pleasure and beauty as worthy subjects for monumental art. This artistic sensibility extended beyond palace walls, which is something we must explore next, the way Minoan aesthetic achievement manifested itself in objects small enough to hold in your hand, in crafts and manufactures that were traded across the known world. Beyond the painted walls and columned halls, the palaces hummed with the daily work of craftspeople. In workshops throughout Knossos and Malia and Phaistos, skilled artisans transformed raw materials into objects of remarkable beauty and utility. These weren't separate from the palace economy but integral to it. The palaces controlled production, distributed resources, collected finished goods, and organised trade. To understand Minoan society, we must understand the work that sustained it. Consider stone carving, one of the most prestigious crafts. Minoan stoneworkers fashioned vessels from a variety of materials: serpentine, limestone, alabaster, obsidian, rock crystal. They used tubular drills to hollow out stone, abrasives to polish surfaces to mirror brightness, and extraordinary patience to create vessels so thin-walled they seem impossible. A rock crystal rhyton, a ritual pouring vessel from Zakros, is so finely made that light passes through its walls. Holding such an object, you can feel its weight, its perfect balance, the smooth coolness of the stone, and you understand that this wasn't just craft but art, not just skill but vision. The stone carvers also made seal stones, small engraved gems used to mark ownership and authenticate documents. These tiny objects, rarely larger than an inch across, feature incredibly detailed scenes carved in intaglio. Bulls and lions, religious symbols, ships and chariots, plants and insects, all rendered in miniature with extraordinary precision. The seal stones required not just manual dexterity, but excellent eyesight, and probably some form of magnification. Some scholars suggest the Minoans might have used water-filled glass spheres as simple magnifying glasses, though no such implements have survived. Pottery production reached industrial scales. The palace workshops produced thousands of vessels each year: storage jars, cooking pots, drinking cups, ritual vessels, transport amphorae. They used the potter's wheel, which had been introduced to Crete around 3000 BCE, and they developed a characteristic style called marine style, featuring octopi, nautili, dolphins, and other sea creatures painted in dark glaze on light backgrounds. The finest pottery was exported across the Mediterranean, turning up in Egypt, Cyprus, Syria, even as far west as Sicily. Metalworking represented perhaps the most valuable craft. Bronze, that alloy of copper and tin, required both materials to be imported to Crete. Copper came from Cyprus primarily, tin from even more distant sources, possibly Afghanistan or Cornwall. The Minoan metalworkers transformed these materials into tools, weapons and objects of extraordinary beauty. Bronze daggers with pommels of rock crystal, gold rings engraved with religious scenes, elaborate bronze vessels with repoussé decoration showing religious processions and bull-leaping scenes. The palace at Malia seems to have been particularly important for metalworking. Excavations revealed workshops with crucibles and moulds, slag heaps indicating extensive smelting, hordes of raw materials and finished objects. Here, master craftspeople trained apprentices in techniques passed down through generations, in the mysteries of alloying and casting, in the art of cold working and annealing, in all the knowledge required to transform stone and metal into wonders. Textile production, though less visible archaeologically because cloth rarely survives, was economically crucial. Linear A tablets record large numbers of sheep, suggesting wool production on an industrial scale. The palaces had specialised textile workshops with banks of looms. Minoan cloth was traded throughout the eastern Mediterranean, valued for its quality and the skill of its dyers. The famous purple dye, extracted from murex shells, probably originated in Crete or the nearby islands before spreading to Phoenicia. What connected all these crafts was the palace system itself, which provided organisation and resources and access to international trade networks. A stone carver in Malaysia didn't worry about sourcing rock crystal from Egypt or gold from Nubia. The palace handled that. The craftsperson focused on skill, on the transformation of material into art. This specialisation, this division of labour, was only possible within a complex, organised society, a society that had moved far beyond simple subsistence into something approaching what we might recognise as civilization. And this civilization expressed itself perhaps most powerfully in its religious practices, in the rituals and ceremonies that bound communities together and connected the human world to the divine. The Minoans worshipped outdoors, or perhaps more accurately, they worshipped in places where the boundary between human space and natural space grew thin. Peak sanctuaries crowned the summits of mountains across Crete, while sacred caves descended into the earth's depths. These weren't temples in the traditional sense, with walls and roofs and priesthoods and elaborate hierarchies. They were places where the landscape itself became charged with religious significance. More than 40 peak sanctuaries have been identified on Crete, located on mountain summits ranging from modest hills to the imposing peak of Mount Juktas, visible from Knossos, where legend said Zeus was born and buried. These sites share common features: an enclosure wall, altars, deposits of votive offerings, and spectacular views. From the peak sanctuaries you can see for miles in every direction, across valleys and plains and out to the sea. The sense of elevation, of being lifted above the ordinary world, must have been profound. The votive offerings left at these sites tell us something about the worshippers' concerns. Clay figurines of humans, often with raised arms in a gesture of worship or supplication. Bronze figurines of animals, especially bulls and cattle, suggesting both the importance of these animals in Minoan economy and their religious significance. Miniature weapons and tools, ceramic vessels that once held liquid offerings. Everything was small, portable, something an individual could carry up the steep mountain paths. Peak sanctuary ritual seems to have occurred primarily in spring and early summer, perhaps connected to agricultural cycles, to the need for rain and good harvests. This wasn't daily worship, but seasonal pilgrimage. Communities would climb the mountains on specific festivals, probably walking in procession, singing hymns we can no longer hear, carrying offerings they'd made or commissioned. At the summit they would perform sacrifices, pour libations, leave their gifts, and perhaps dance or feast or participate in rituals whose details are lost to us. Sacred caves offered a complementary religious experience: descent rather than ascent, entry into the earth rather than rise toward the sky. The Camores Cave. High on the southern slopes of Mount Ida was a major sanctuary. The Dictaean Cave, where Zeus was supposedly hidden as an infant to protect him from his father Kronos, attracted pilgrims for thousands of years. The Idaean Cave, also associated with Zeus, contained rich deposits of bronze shields and other weapons, offerings from worshippers who came seeking the god's favour. Caves are places of mystery in every culture that knows them. They're portals, thresholds, places where the ordinary rules don't apply. In darkness and silence, in the drip of water and the strange formations of stalactites and stalagmites, the imagination finds supernatural presence easily. The Minoans understood this. They chose their sacred caves carefully, seeking out the most impressive chambers, the deepest descents, the places where water flowed from the rock, or where acoustic properties made every sound reverberate strangely. Archaeological evidence suggests that cave ritual involved fire, ash deposits, burned bones, traces of oils and resins that would have perfumed the darkness. Imagine the scene: torchlight flickering on wet stone walls, shadows dancing, smoke rising to disappear into black void above, the murmur of prayers or chants echoing until the cave itself seemed to speak. It must have been overwhelming, transformative, the kind of religious experience that stays with you for life. Both peak sanctuaries and sacred caves remained in use for centuries, some for more than 1,000 years. Generation after generation climbed the same mountains, descended into the same caves, repeated rituals whose origins were lost in time, but whose power remained undiminished. This continuity of practice suggests deep cultural stability, a society that maintained its religious traditions even as other aspects of life changed, even as palaces rose and fell and rose again. And this religious sensibility wasn't separate from daily life, but woven through it. Which brings us to consider the famous bull-leaping ceremonies, those dramatic rituals that combined athleticism and religious devotion, and that have captured the imagination of everyone who encounters them. Perhaps no aspect of Minoan culture has generated more fascination and debate than bull-leaping. The frescoes are clear: young athletes, male and female, grasping the horns of a charging bull, vaulting over its back in a perfect arc, landing on their feet behind the animal. But is this what actually happened? Could anyone survive such a feat, and why would they attempt it? Let's start with what we can say with confidence. Bulls were sacred to the Minoans. They appear constantly in religious art and iconography. Bull's head rhytons, ritual vessels shaped like bull heads with mouths open to pour libations. bull horns as architectural elements, lining the edges of altars and roofs, bronze figurines of bulls left as votive offerings. The animal represented power, fertility, the dangerous vitality of nature that must be honoured and somehow brought into relationship with human civilization. The bull-leaping frescoes show a consistent sequence. First, a leper approaches a charging bull from the front. As the bull lowers its head to gore, the leper grasps the horns. The bull, in its instinctive response to this contact, tosses its head back, lifting the leper off the ground. At the apex of this motion, the leper releases the horns and somersaults backward over the bull's back. A catcher, positioned behind the bull, stands ready to break the leper's fall. It's a coordinated team effort, requiring split-second timing, absolute trust, and extraordinary courage. Is this physically possible? Modern attempts to recreate bull leaping have met with very limited success. Bulls are unpredictable, powerful, and dangerous. Their horns can disembowel a person with a single thrust. Their kicks can shatter bones. Training bulls to charge consistently enough for repeated leaping would be incredibly difficult. And even if you succeeded, the risk of death or serious injury would be extreme. Some scholars suggest the frescoes depict idealized versions of the ritual, artistic representations rather than documentary evidence. Perhaps the actual ceremony was less acrobatic, more symbolic. Perhaps young people touched the horns of restrained bulls in a ritual gesture. Perhaps the full athletic leap was attempted only rarely, on the most important religious occasions, with full understanding that it might end in tragedy. Others point to modern parallels. In Portugal and parts of southern France, vaqueros practice a similar sport, grasping bulls by the horns and holding on while the bull attempts to shake them free. It's dangerous but possible with training and skill. In ancient Crete, where bulls were part of daily life, where young people grew up around these animals, understanding their behaviour instinctively, perhaps the feat was less impossible than it seems to us. What seems clear is that bull leaping, however it was actually performed, was a religious ritual, not entertainment or sport in our modern sense. It took place in the central courts of the palaces, in spaces designed for communal gathering. It happened on sacred occasions, possibly during spring festivals celebrating renewal and fertility. The participants, both male and female, were probably drawn from elite families, young people in the prime of their lives, offering their bodies as intermediaries between human and divine power. The religious significance seems to involve transformation and mastery. The bull represents wild nature, uncontrollable force, the power that both sustains and threatens agricultural civilization. By approaching this power, touching it, flying over it, the leper momentarily transcends normal human limitations. They become something other, something between human and God, between mortal and sacred beast. And when they land safely, when the ritual succeeds, it proves that human skill and courage can transform danger into beauty, can take the wild power of nature and weave it into the fabric of civilized life. If the leper died, and surely some must have, that too had meaning. Sacrifice is central to most ancient religions. The blood spilled in the sacred court wasn't waste but offering, wasn't tragedy but fulfillment of religious obligation. The death would be mourned, certainly, but also honoured, perhaps even envied. To die in this way was to achieve a form of immortality, to become part of the stories told around fires for generations to come. And this brings us to a broader consideration of Minoan religious life, to the goddesses and gods they worshipped, to the priestesses and priests who mediated between human and divine worlds, to the ceremonies and festivals that marked the turning of the year and bound communities together in shared devotion. The Minoans worshipped a goddess, or perhaps multiple goddesses, or different aspects of a single divine feminine principle. The evidence is fragmentary, open to interpretation, but certain themes appear consistently enough in the art and iconography to suggest that female divinity held central importance in Minoan religious life. The most famous image comes from Knossos, a faience figurine about a foot tall showing a woman in elaborate Minoan dress, with a tight bodice leaving her breasts bare, a tiered skirt, and an elaborate headdress. In each hand she holds a writhing snake. This is the so-called snake goddess, though whether she represents a deity or a priestess performing a ritual or a mythological figure remains uncertain. The snake suggests chthonic powers, connection to the earth and underworld. The bare breasts indicate fertility, nourishment, life-giving power, the fixed. Forward stare has an intensity that transcends simple representation. Another recurring image shows a female figure standing on a mountain peak, flanked by lions or other wild animals. She raises her arms toward the sky, and the beasts seem to acknowledge her authority. This is the mistress of animals, a type of goddess known throughout the ancient Mediterranean, from the Artemis of later Greek religion to the Ishtar of Mesopotamia. She represents sovereignty over wild nature, the power that domesticates chaos, that brings animal fertility into human service. Frescoes and seal stones show goddess figures receiving offerings, presiding over ceremonies, floating in divine epiphany above worshipping crowds. Sometimes she appears in gardens or groves, sometimes in architectural settings, presumably temples or palace shrines. Often she is accompanied by young women, priestesses or attendants, who assist in the rituals or perhaps serve as representatives of the goddess in human form. Male deities seem less prominent in Minoan religious art, though they certainly existed. A young male god, often shown with a spear or staff, appears on some seal stones. He might be a divine son, a dying and rising deity associated with agricultural cycles, similar to figures like Adonis or Tammuz in Near Eastern religions. But he never achieves the visual dominance of the female divine figures. Priestesses clearly held significant religious authority. Multiple frescoes show processions of women in elaborate dress carrying ritual objects. At Knossos, the so-called priestess fresco shows women in profile, with intricate hairstyles and jewellery, moving with stately grace. These weren't deities themselves, but human intermediaries, women who had dedicated themselves to religious service, who had learned the hymns and ceremonies and seasonal rituals that maintained the proper relationship between human communities and the divine powers that sustained them. Evidence suggests that high priestesses might have held political power, as well as religious authority. Some scholars propose that Minoan society was matrilineal, with power and property passing through female lines, with the palace rulers being either female or deriving their legitimacy from royal women. The Linear A tablets, frustratingly, could settle this question if we could read them, but for now it remains speculative. Religious practice centred on palace shrines and peak sanctuaries and sacred caves, but it also pervaded daily life in countless smaller ways. Every household probably had its own shrine, a simple altar or niche where family members could make offerings and prayers. Every workshop probably had its patron deity or protective spirit. Every field and grove and spring had its associated power that required acknowledgement and respect. The religious calendar probably followed agricultural and seasonal cycles, spring festivals celebrating renewal and new growth, summer ceremonies giving thanks for harvest, autumn rituals preparing for winter, winter observations marking the sun's return, and the promise of another year. Each season brought its own ceremonies, its own opportunities for the community to gather, to celebrate, to reinforce the bonds that held society together. And these bonds were tested periodically by the natural disasters that have always threatened Crete. Which brings us to consider one of the defining features of Minoan life, the constant presence of earthquakes, those sudden, violent reminders that the earth beneath their feet was never entirely stable, never completely trustworthy, and how this geological reality shaped Minoan culture and eventually played a role in the civilization's decline. Crete sits on the boundary between two tectonic plates, the African plate pushing northward against the Eurasian plate. This collision, operating over millions of years, raised the mountains that form Crete's spine, and it continues today, generating regular seismic activity. The Minoans lived with earthquakes the way some cultures live with floods or hurricanes, as a recurring threat, something to prepare for, to build against, to incorporate into their understanding of the world and the gods. The palaces bear evidence of this geological reality in their very architecture. Walls are often thicker at the base than seems structurally necessary. Wooden beams are integrated into stone walls, not for decoration but to provide flexibility, to allow walls to move during tremors without collapsing. Doorways and windows are reinforced with heavy timber frames. These weren't arbitrary design choices, but lessons learned through generations of experience. The accumulated wisdom of a society that knew the earth could turn against them without warning. The archaeological record shows multiple destruction layers at Minoan sites, moments when fire and collapse buried the daily life of the palaces and towns. Around 1700 BCE, a major earthquake seems to have damaged many settlements across Crete. The palaces were rebuilt, often more elaborately than before, suggesting the society had the resilience and resources to recover from disaster. But the memory of destruction must have remained, a shadow behind even the brightest festivals, a knowledge that everything could end in minutes if the earth chose to shake violently enough. Earthquakes would have been interpreted religiously. The gods were angry, or testing their worshippers, or engaged in some cosmic conflict whose tremors manifested in the physical world. This understanding probably shaped religious practice, generating specific rituals meant to propitiate whatever powers controlled the earth's stability. The caves might have been seen as entrances to an underworld where these powers dwelt, making offerings there not just acts of general devotion, but specific attempts to maintain cosmic balance, to keep the earth quiet and stable. The psychological impact of living with this constant threat shouldn't be underestimated. Imagine going to sleep each night knowing that before morning, the walls might be shaking, the roof might be collapsing, everything familiar might be reduced to rubble and screams. This creates a particular kind of cultural character, perhaps one that values the present moment more urgently, that celebrates life and beauty more intensely because both could be snatched away without warning. Some scholars suggest that the Minoan emphasis on portable wealth, on jewellery and fine objects rather than massive monuments, reflects this geological reality. If palaces could be destroyed in minutes, better to invest in things that could be saved, carried away, rebuilt elsewhere. Better to develop skills and crafts that travelled with you than to pour resources into monumental architecture that might not survive the next major earthquake. The society developed warning systems and emergency procedures. When an earthquake struck, people knew to evacuate buildings immediately, to move to open spaces where collapse couldn't crush them. The palaces themselves were designed with multiple exits, wide corridors, courtyards that provided safe gathering points. This wasn't paranoia, but practical necessity, the kind of preparedness that comes from hard experience. Yet despite the constant threat, despite the periodic disasters that damaged or destroyed their cities, the Minoans persisted. They rebuilt. They refined their architecture to better withstand future shocks. They continued to create art of extraordinary beauty, to trade across the Mediterranean, to develop their distinctive culture. There's something admirable in this resilience, in the refusal to be defeated by natural forces beyond human control. But ultimately, the geological instability of their island home would contribute to their decline, not directly through Cretan earthquakes, but through an earthquake on a neighbouring island, an eruption that generated tsunami waves and ashfall, that disrupted trade networks and perhaps served as the final blow to a civilization already weakened by other factors. And this catastrophe, the eruption of Thera, deserves our careful consideration as we move forward in our journey through Minoan history. About 70 miles north of Crete lies the island of Santorini, known in ancient times as Thera. Today, it forms a broken ring around a submerged caldera, the flooded remnant of a volcanic chamber that emptied catastrophically in the mid-2nd millennium BCE. This eruption, one of the largest in human history, fundamentally altered the Eastern Mediterranean and may have delivered a devastating blow to Minoan civilization at its height. The modern island of Thera was once much larger, a roughly circular landmass rising from the sea. At its centre stood a volcanic mountain, building pressure for centuries as magma accumulated in the chamber beneath. Sometime around 1600 BCE, give or take several decades, the exact date remains debated, this pressure exceeded the strength of the rock containing it. What followed was cataclysmic. Volcanic eruptions are measured on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, which ranges from 0 to 8. The Thera eruption was at least a VEI 6, possibly a 7, releasing approximately 40 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. To give that scale some context, the famous eruption of Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii was a VEI 5, 10 times smaller. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which killed tens of thousands and was heard thousands of miles away, was a VEI 6, roughly comparable to Thera. The eruption would have occurred in stages, each more violent than the last. First came warnings, smaller earthquakes, changes in the island's hot springs, perhaps steam explosions as groundwater contacted rising magma. Then the first major explosive phase, sending a column of ash and pumice 25 miles into the stratosphere. This column would have been visible from Crete, a towering pillar of darkness rising from the northern horizon. Prevailing winds carried the ash eastward, but some fell on Crete, perhaps several inches of fine grey dust coating everything. Infiltrating buildings, choking wells, covering fields. For an agricultural society, even this relatively minor ashfall would have been serious, destroying crops, contaminating water, sickening livestock. But the ashfall was merely the beginning. The main explosive phase likely occurred when the volcanic chamber emptied catastrophically, when the overlying rock collapsed into the void, when the sea rushed in to fill the caldera and instantly vaporized into superheated steam. This generated massive tsunami waves, radiating outward in all directions, crossing the distance to northern Crete in perhaps 30 minutes. Tsunami waves behave differently than ordinary waves. In deep water they move fast but aren't particularly tall. As they approach shore, as the water shallows, they slow down and rise up, all the energy concentrated vertically. The Thera tsunami waves probably reached heights of 15 to 30 feet by the time they struck the north coast of Crete. That's enough to sweep several hundred meters inland, to demolish coastal settlements, to drown anyone who couldn't reach high ground fast enough. Archaeological evidence from Thera itself, from the beautifully preserved town of Akrotiri buried under volcanic ash, shows that the inhabitants had warning. The buildings were cleared of valuables and portable goods before the final eruption. People evacuated, carrying what they could. This suggests the eruption built over days or weeks, giving time for organised response. Surely the Minoans on Crete received similar warnings. Surely they understood what that towering ash column meant. Surely they prepared as best they could. But preparation has limits when facing natural forces of this magnitude. The tsunami would have destroyed Crete's northern ports, demolished coastal palaces and towns, killed thousands who lived or worked near the sea. The ashfall would have ruined crops across the island. The impact on trade would have been immediate and severe, as shipping stopped, as ports were damaged or destroyed, as the entire eastern Mediterranean dealt with the eruption's effects. Some scholars suggest even more dramatic impacts. The eruption injected massive amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it formed sulfate aerosols that reflected sunlight and cooled global temperatures. Ice cores from Greenland show evidence of a volcanic event around this time period. Tree ring data from North America and Europe shows unusually cool summers in the mid-17th century BCE. The eruption may have triggered a volcanic winter, a period of several years when global temperatures dropped, harvests failed, and societies already under stress began to collapse. Did the Thera eruption destroy Minoan civilization? Not directly, not immediately. The palaces were rebuilt. Life continued. But the damage was severe enough, the disruption significant enough, that it might have been the beginning of the end, the first in a series of catastrophes that would ultimately overwhelm Minoan society. And to understand this decline fully, we need to examine the relationship between the Minoans and their neighbours to the north, the Mycenaean Greeks, who would eventually dominate Crete and transform its culture forever. On the Greek mainland, in the Peloponnese and Attica and Boeotia, a different civilization was developing during the same centuries that saw Minoan palaces rise on Crete. These were the Mycenaeans, named after their most important citadel at Mycenae, though they controlled numerous centres: Pylos, Tiryns, Athens, Thebes, or Komnenos. The Mycenaeans spoke an early form of Greek, were ancestors to the classical Greeks of later centuries, and unlike the Minoans, they built their palaces as fortresses, surrounded by massive walls designed for war. The differences between Minoan and Mycenaean culture are striking. Where Minoan palaces sprawled open and unfortified, trusting in their remoteness and perhaps naval superiority for protection, Mycenaean citadels crouched behind cyclopean walls, limestone blocks so large that later Greeks believed giants must have built them. Where Minoan art celebrated nature and religious ceremony and peaceful processions, Mycenaean art depicted warfare, hunting, chariots, warriors with spears and swords. Where Minoan society seems to have been relatively egalitarian, at least among the elite, Mycenaean society was rigidly hierarchical, dominated by warrior aristocracy. The Mycenaeans were not isolated from the Minoans. Trade connected the two cultures from early on. Minoan pottery and seal stones turn up at Mycenaean sites. Mycenaean warriors apparently learned or adopted aspects of Minoan dress and artistic style. The famous Mycenaean shaft graves at Mycenae, dated to around 1600 BCE, contained weapons and gold masks and jewellery that show clear Minoan influence, suggesting the Mycenaean elite were eager consumers of Minoan luxury goods and perhaps Minoan cultural prestige. But influence flowed both ways, and over time the balance of power shifted. The Mycenaeans grew stronger, more organised, more militaristic. Their population increased, their technology improved. Most significantly, they developed writing, adapting the Minoan Linear A script to create Linear B, which recorded their Greek language. This allowed for sophisticated administrative systems, for control of large territories, for the kind of bureaucratic organisation that supports military expansion. Around 1500 BCE, something dramatic happened on Crete. The palaces show signs of new rulers, new priorities, new cultural influences. Linear B tablets appear, recording Greek rather than the Minoan language. Weapons become more prominent in burials and artistic depictions. The peaceful, nature-loving culture of the Minoans begins to transform into something harder, more martial, more Greek. Scholars debate whether this change came through invasion, or gradual infiltration, or intermarriage, or economic domination. Perhaps Mycenaean warriors conquered Crete militarily, establishing themselves as a new ruling class. Perhaps Mycenaean traders and settlers arrived peacefully over decades, gradually achieving economic control and then political power. Perhaps a Minoan palace dynasty allied themselves with Mycenaean powers, adopted Mycenaean customs, until Minoan culture was absorbed from within. The Linear B tablets from Knossos, dating to the period after Mycenaean arrival, show a society deeply militarized. There are records of chariots and chariot wheels, bronze armour and weapons, military units and their equipment. There are records of textile production clearly meant for military purposes, thousands of units of standardized cloth. The palace economy has been reorganized around warfare in a way entirely foreign to earlier Minoan practice. Yet Minoan culture didn't vanish overnight. The palaces continued to function. Artisans still created pottery in Minoan styles, though often with Mycenaean innovations. Religious practices probably continued largely unchanged, perhaps with new gods added to the pantheon, or old gods reinterpreted through Greek mythological frameworks. In the countryside, in villages away from palace centres, daily life might have changed very little. people still grew olives and grapes, still herded sheep and goats, still participated in seasonal festivals and celebrated births and mourned deaths in ways their ancestors would have recognised. What was lost was the distinctive character of Minoan civilization, that particular combination of artistic achievement and religious sensibility and social organisation that had made Crete unique in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans brought their own values, their own gods, their own understanding of power and prestige and proper social order. Minoan culture became a substrate, a foundation upon which something new and hybrid was built. And this hybrid culture, Mycenaean-dominated but Minoan-influenced, would face its own catastrophes in the centuries ahead. Which brings us to consider the end of the Bronze Age. That period of widespread collapse and transformation that swept across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE and left the Minoan palaces empty and silent, monuments to a civilization that had ended. Around 1300 BCE, the palace at Knossos burned. The fire was intense enough to bake the clay tablets in the archives, accidentally preserving them. But it destroyed the palace as a functioning centre. The columns collapsed, the floors caved in, the painted walls cracked and fell. When the flames finally died and the smoke cleared, what remained was ruins, too damaged to repair, too expensive to rebuild, too symbolic of an ending to restore. The exact cause of this destruction remains uncertain. Earthquake is always possible on Crete, and a major seismic event could have toppled the palace and started fires from fallen oil lamps and cooking hearths. Invasion is another possibility, though there's no clear evidence of battle, no skeletons bearing weapon wounds, no smashed defences or breached walls. Internal unrest, perhaps a revolt against Mycenaean overlords or economic collapse leading to abandonment and subsequent looting and accidental fire, represents a third option. What's clear is that Knossos was not alone. Across Crete, the other palaces met similar fates, all within a relatively short period. Phaistos was abandoned, Malia was destroyed, Zakros burned. The entire palace system, which had defined Minoan civilization for over 500 years, collapsed. The administrative structure vanished. The workshops fell silent. The storerooms were emptied or looted. The frescoes cracked and faded under sun and rain. This Cretan collapse was part of a broader catastrophe that struck the entire eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. This period, sometimes called the Late Bronze Age collapse, saw the end of multiple civilizations. The Mycenaean palaces on mainland Greece were destroyed or abandoned. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia collapsed completely. Its capital Hattusir burned so thoroughly that the stones were calcined. The great trading cities of the Syrian coast were destroyed. Egypt, though it survived, was invaded multiple times by groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who came from the north in great migrations. The causes of this widespread collapse remain debated among scholars, with no single explanation satisfying everyone. Climate change may have played a role, with extended drought making agriculture difficult across the eastern Mediterranean. Systems collapse is another theory, proposing that the complex trade networks and administrative systems of the Bronze Age civilizations had become so interdependent that disruption in one region cascaded throughout the system. Invasion by outsiders, whether the mysterious Sea Peoples or Indo-European groups moving south from the Balkans, certainly occurred in many regions. Perhaps it was all of these factors working together. A perfect storm of environmental stress and economic disruption, and military threats that proved too much for Bronze Age societies to withstand. For Crete specifically, the island's strategic importance may have made it a target. Whoever controlled Crete controlled the central Mediterranean, the trade routes connecting east and west, the sea lanes that ships had to use when sailing from Egypt to Greece, or from the Levant to Italy. In a time of widespread disruption and resource scarcity, Crete's remaining wealth would have been attractive to raiders or migrating groups seeking new homes. but there's also evidence that the palaces were already in decline before their final destruction. The Linear B tablets from Knossos show a society under strain, with records suggesting difficulty maintaining the administrative system, problems collecting taxes or tribute, perhaps economic difficulties. The population may have been declining. Trade certainly decreased in the final centuries of palace civilization. It's possible that the final destruction was merely the last act of a decline that had been underway for generations. After the palaces fell, Crete didn't become uninhabited. People continued to live on the island, in villages and small towns, practicing agriculture and herding, making pottery and tools, worshipping their gods. But they did so without the organisational framework the palaces had provided, without the scribes and administrators, without the workshops and trade networks. Life became simpler, more local, more isolated from the wider Mediterranean world. The memory of the palaces survived, though, transformed into legend. The Greeks who came to dominate the island in later centuries told stories about King Minos, his wife Pasiphae, the Minotaur in its labyrinth, Theseus and Ariadne, Daedalus and Icarus. These myths probably preserved dim memories of actual places and events, distorted and elaborated over centuries of oral transmission until history became mythology, until the palaces of the Minoans became the settings for tales of gods and heroes and monsters. And these myths would, millennia later, guide archaeologists back to Crete, back to the ruins of Knossos, where one man's obsession would resurrect the Minoans from obscurity and introduce their civilization to the modern world. For more than 3,000 years, the Minoan palaces lay buried or ruined, known only to the people who lived near them, if they were known at all. Local farmers might have ploughed fields where palace courtyards once stood. Shepherds might have sheltered in partially standing walls during storms. But no one understood what these ruins represented. No one imagined the sophisticated civilization that had once thrived on Crete. The rediscovery began in the late 19th century, when a wealthy English archaeologist named Arthur Evans became fascinated by seal stones he saw in Athens' antiquity shops. The stones bore mysterious inscriptions, a script no one could read, and Evans became convinced they were evidence of a pre-Greek civilization, something older than the Mycenaeans, perhaps even older than Troy. He decided to search for the source of these seal stones, and his research led him to Crete, to a place called Kephala Hill near the modern village of Knossos. Local tradition held that ancient ruins lay beneath the hill. A Greek archaeologist named Minos Kalokairinos had conducted limited excavations there in 1878, uncovering storage magazines and massive clay jars, but political complications had forced him to stop. Evans, with more resources and fewer constraints, began large-scale excavations in 1900. Purchasing the land and hiring hundreds of workers to remove the accumulated soil and reveal what lay beneath. What Evans found exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. As the earth came away, walls appeared, then courtyards, then room after room after room, extending in every direction, descending in terraces down the hillside. The scale was enormous. The preservation in many areas remarkably good. Walls still stood to considerable heights. Painted plaster clung to surfaces. Objects remained in place. Pottery vessels, stone tools, clay tablets inscribed with the mysterious script. Evans worked at Knossos for over 30 years, though the most intensive excavation occurred in the first few seasons. He uncovered the central courtyard, the throne room with its alabaster seat still in place, the elaborate residential quarters with their sophisticated plumbing, the storage magazines with their rows of massive pithoi. He found frescoes that, when carefully removed and reconstructed, revealed a world of colour and grace and naturalistic beauty that no one had imagined characterised Bronze Age article. But Evans didn't simply excavate and document. He reconstructed. Walls that had collapsed were rebuilt. Columns that had fallen were re-erected, cast in concrete and painted in what Evans believed were the original colours. Upper stories were reconstructed based on architectural evidence and Evans's own interpretations. The result was dramatic and controversial, giving visitors a sense of what the palace might have looked like when occupied, but also imposing Evans' vision on the ruins in ways that can never be entirely undone. Evans named the civilization he had discovered after King Minos, the legendary ruler of Crete mentioned in Greek mythology. He called the palace system he found the Minoan civilization, and he developed an elaborate chronological system dividing Minoan history into early, middle, and late periods, each with multiple subdivisions. This system, though modified and refined by later scholars, remains the basic framework for understanding Minoan chronology. Some of Evans' interpretations have been questioned or revised by subsequent research. His reconstruction of the palace may not accurately reflect Minoan architecture. His belief that Knossos was the centre of a unified Minoan empire may overstate the palace's political authority. His identification of certain features, like the throne room, may project later Greek or European concepts onto a society that understood power and kingship quite differently. But Evans' achievement remains monumental. Single-handedly, through determination and resources and archaeological skill, he resurrected an entire civilization from obscurity. Before Evans, no one knew the Minoans existed as a distinct culture separate from the Mycenaeans. After Evans, Minoan art and architecture and culture became subjects of scholarly study, popular fascination, and aesthetic influence. The Minoans took their place in the long history of Mediterranean civilization. Recognised as creators of the first complex society in Europe, the excavations at Knossos inspired work at other Cretan sites. Italian archaeologists worked at Phaistos. French teams excavated at Malia. Greek archaeologists explored numerous smaller sites. Each excavation added to the understanding of Minoan culture, correcting and expanding Evans' initial interpretations. And this archaeological work continues today, more carefully, more scientifically, using techniques Evans never imagined, still revealing new aspects of this ancient civilization. And what these excavations show, beyond the palaces and frescoes and clay tablets, is a culture's daily life, the ordinary activities that filled the hours between festivals and ceremonies, the work and craft and domestic routine that was the true substance of Minoan existence. Beyond the palace walls, away from ceremonies and bull-leaping and religious processions, most Minoans lived lives that would have been recognisable to farmers and craftspeople across the ancient Mediterranean. They woke with the sun, worked through the day, ate evening meals with family, slept in simple houses. Their concerns were immediate and practical: crops and weather, health and family, the small joys and sorrows that fill every human life regardless of era or culture. Minoan houses were built of stone and mud brick, usually on stone foundations with mud brick walls plastered and sometimes painted. Better houses had multiple rooms organised around a central hall, with separate spaces for cooking, sleeping, storage, and in some cases workshops. Many houses had second stories, reached by internal staircases or external stairs, providing additional living or storage space. Windows were small to keep out summer heat and winter cold. But most houses had courtyards or light wells providing natural illumination. The typical Minoan diet centred on the Mediterranean triad: grain, olives, and grapes. Wheat and barley were ground into flour for bread and porridge. Olives were pressed for oil, used in cooking and lamps and as a trade good. Grapes were eaten fresh or dried into raisins or fermented into wine. This was supplemented by legumes, lentils, chickpeas, broad beans, and by vegetables like onions and garlic. Figs and other fruits added sweetness. Honey was the primary sweetener, as sugarcane was unknown in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Meat was less common, probably eaten mainly on festival occasions. Sheep and goats provided wool and milk as well as occasional meat. Pigs were raised specifically for eating. Cattle were valuable work animals and sources of milk, too precious to slaughter frequently. Fish and shellfish supplemented the diet. especially in coastal regions. The palace archives record large catches of fish, suggesting organised fishing industries that processed and salted fish for storage and distribution. Clothing followed consistent patterns. Men typically wore loincloths or short kilts, leaving the chest bare. For special occasions or in cold weather, they might add wrapped cloaks. Women wore long skirts and tight bodices that left the breasts exposed, a style that seems shocking to modern sensibilities, but that carried no improper connotation in Minoan culture. Both sexes wore their hair long, often elaborately arranged and decorated with jewellery. The elite dressed more elaborately, with finer fabrics and more jewellery, but the basic styles were universal. Work organised itself around seasons and agricultural rhythms. Spring meant ploughing and planting. Long days in the fields preparing soil and sowing seed. Summer brought weeding and irrigation, tending crops through the hot months. Autumn was harvest. The year's labour finally rewarded, grain cut and threshed, grapes picked and pressed, olives gathered from the trees. Winter was for maintenance and preparation, repairing tools and buildings, spinning and weaving, the quieter work that filled the dark months. Craftspeople followed different rhythms but equally demanding schedules. A potter needed to prepare clay, wedge it to remove air bubbles, centre it on the wheel, throw the vessel, trim it when leather hard, let it dry completely, prepare the kiln, fire the pots through long hours of carefully maintained heat, then allow everything to cool slowly. A metal worker needed to prepare moulds, melt bronze to exactly the right temperature, pour carefully, let castings cool, then finish them through hammering and grinding and polishing. Every craft had its own requirements, its own knowledge base, its own rhythm of work. Children learned by watching and imitating. A farmer's son worked alongside his father from an early age, learning when to plant and how to plough, and which fields were most productive. A potter's daughter grew up amid the smell of wet clay and wood smoke, her hands learning the feel of clay before she learned to read or write, if she learned those skills at all. Education was informal, practical, passed down through families and workshop apprenticeships rather than schools. Entertainment and leisure existed even in this working life. Music was important, with lyres and flutes and drums mentioned in later Greek accounts of Minoan culture. Dancing was central to religious festivals, but probably also a secular pleasure. Athletes practiced running and jumping, perhaps preparing for roles in bull leaping, or simply enjoying physical competition. People gathered in the evenings to tell stories, to sing, to share the day's events and the eternal gossip that enlivens every community. Family structure centred on the household, which might include grandparents and unmarried siblings and perhaps servants or slaves, all working together as an economic unit. Marriage probably happened relatively young, with women married in their mid to late teens, men in their early 20s. Children were precious, and infant mortality was high. As it was throughout the ancient world, every child who survived to adulthood represented years of care and worry and love, and when people died, they were mourned and buried with care, placed in tombs that range from simple pits to elaborate multi-chambered structures depending on wealth and status. Grave goods accompanied the dead, pottery vessels that had held offerings of food and drink, jewellery they had worn in life, tools they might need in whatever afterlife the Minoans imagined awaited them. This was the texture of Minoan life, the daily reality that underlies all the palace complexes and artistic achievements and historical events. And as we move deeper into our journey, as the night settles and our exploration becomes more contemplative, we can begin to consider what all this accumulated detail reveals about the Minoan worldview, about how these people understood themselves and their place in the cosmos. The Minoans were sailors, and their ships connected Crete to a wider world that stretched from Spain to the Levant, from Egypt to the Black Sea. Trade was not peripheral to Minoan civilization, but central to it, the economic foundation that supported palace complexes and workshops, and the entire elaborate social structure. Without trade, without the ships that crossed the Mediterranean carrying goods and ideas and people, Minoan culture as we understand it could not have existed. Minoan ships appear in frescoes and seal stone carvings, and while we have no surviving vessels, wood rarely preserves in the Mediterranean climate. These artistic depictions give us a sense of their character. They were sailing ships primarily, with square sails for catching the wind, though they also had oars for calm days or precise manoeuvring in harbours. They ranged in size from small coastal traders to larger vessels capable of crossing open water, perhaps 50 feet long, able to carry several tons of cargo. The sailing season lasted roughly from spring through autumn, from the time the winter storm subsided until they returned. Mediterranean weather in summer is generally predictable, with reliable winds and clear skies, making navigation feasible even with Bronze Age technology. Sailors navigated by landmarks when possible, hugging coastlines, but they also ventured across open water, using the sun and stars for orientation, relying on accumulated knowledge of currents and winds and seasonal patterns. What did Minoan ships carry? Primarily they exported olive oil and wine, the liquid wealth of Crete. Shipped in distinctive pottery amphorae that appear in archaeological sites across the Mediterranean. They exported fine pottery, especially the elaborate marine-style vessels that were prized possessions far from their place of manufacture. They exported textiles, though these rarely survive archaeologically, and they exported less tangible goods, artistic influence, religious ideas, perhaps even Minoan craftspeople who travelled to work in distant workshops. In return, Crete imported essential materials the island lacked. Copper came from Cyprus, that large island to the east that took its name from the metal. Tin, necessary to alloy with copper to make bronze, came from more distant sources, perhaps Afghanistan or Spain or Cornwall in Britain. Gold came from Egypt or Nubia, ivory from Syria, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Having travelled thousands of miles through multiple trade networks before reaching Cretan workshops. Amber from the Baltic. These exotic materials, transformed by Minoan craftspeople into jewellery and decorative objects, demonstrated wealth and connected the Minoan elite to a luxury trade network that spanned the known world. Trade ports existed at multiple locations around Crete's coast. The palace at Zakros directly overlooked its harbour. Knossos had a port at Amnissos, about 5 miles north of the palace, connected by road. Malia had direct access to the coast. Phaistos controlled harbours on the south coast. These ports had warehouses for storing goods, workshops for preparing exports and processing imports, and doubtless customs officials recording what entered and left the island, filling out clay tablets now lost or still waiting to be discovered. Egyptian records mention a place they called Keftiu, which many scholars identify with Crete. Egyptian tomb paintings show delegations from Keftiu bringing tribute or trade goods to the pharaoh's court. Fine vessels, jewellery, luxury textiles. The figures in these paintings wear Minoan-style clothing, and the objects they carry match artefacts found on Crete, leaving little doubt about the identification. This demonstrates that Minoan-Egyptian contact was official and significant. Maintained over centuries, the Minoans probably had trading colonies or settlements outside Crete. On several Aegean islands, particularly Thera before its eruption, settlements show strong Minoan cultural influence, with houses built in Minoan style and pottery of Minoan manufacture. These might have been Minoan colonies. Or they might have been indigenous populations who adopted Minoan culture through trade and contact. The distinction matters less than the evidence of Minoan cultural reach extending well beyond Crete itself. Trade brings more than goods. It brings ideas, technologies, artistic styles, religious concepts, stories and myths and ways of understanding the world. Every merchant ship that arrived in a Cretan port carried not just amphorae and ingots, but information, news from distant lands, stories about other peoples and their customs, innovations in craft techniques, new fashions in dress or jewellery. The Minoans were not isolated on their island, but participants in a vibrant Mediterranean world of exchange and interconnection. this cosmopolitan character, this engagement with the wider world, shaped Minoan culture profoundly. The artistic sophistication we admire in Minoan frescoes draws on Egyptian techniques and Near Eastern motifs adapted to Minoan sensibilities. The palace architecture incorporates elements seen in Syrian and Anatolian buildings. The religious iconography shares themes with goddess worship throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The Minoans were not simply receivers of influence, but active participants in cultural exchange, taking what they learned and creating something distinctively their own. And this brings us to consider one of the most mysterious aspects of Minoan civilization: how their society was actually organised, who held power, and how it was exercised. Questions that remain frustratingly unclear despite decades of archaeological research. The question of how Minoan society was organised politically remains one of the great unresolved debates in archaeology. We know the palaces were centres of power, but what kind of power? Who lived in these vast complexes? What authority did they exercise over the surrounding territory and population? Were the Minoans ruled by kings, by priests, by councils of elders, by high priestesses? The evidence allows for multiple interpretations, and scholars have proposed radically different models. The traditional view, established largely by Arthur Evans, sees the palaces as monarchies. The throne room at Knossos, with its alabaster seat and surrounding benches, seemed clear evidence for royal power. Evans imagined priest-kings ruling from these palaces, combining religious and political authority in single figures who controlled large territories and commanded the labour and resources of thousands of people. This model drew on Near Eastern parallels, on the god-kings of Egypt and Mesopotamia, on the assumption that complex societies require centralised hierarchical authority. But several features of Minoan society challenge this interpretation. First, the palaces are not defensively located or fortified, which is unusual for royal residences in the Bronze Age. Second, Minoan art shows no clear depictions of rulers or the kind of royal propaganda common in contemporary Near Eastern cultures. There are no colossal statues of kings, no stelae recording military victories, no royal tomb complexes proclaiming dynastic glory. Third, the palace economy, as revealed by the Linear B tablets from the Mycenaean period, shows administrative complexity and bureaucratic organisation, but not necessarily monarchical control. Some scholars propose instead that the palaces were primarily religious centres, controlled by priestesses or priestly councils rather than secular kings. This interpretation emphasises the religious art found throughout the palaces, the shrine rooms and lustral basins, the prevalence of goddess imagery, the apparent importance of female figures in religious contexts. Perhaps each palace was ruled by a high priestess, who served as earthly representative of the goddess, who organised the religious festivals and received tribute or offerings, who controlled the palace workshops and storerooms as religious property rather than royal wealth. Yet another model sees the palaces as collective institutions, controlled by councils of elite families rather than single rulers. In this interpretation, the palaces functioned as ceremonial centres and economic warehouses that served larger communities, organising trade and craft production and religious festivals, but not exercising top-down authority. Power might have been more distributed, more consensus-based than in the rigidly hierarchical societies of Egypt or Mesopotamia. The truth might involve elements of all these models. Power rarely exists in simple forms. Minoan society probably had individuals who held special authority, whether as rulers or high priests or wealthy aristocrats. These individuals probably controlled the palaces and the economic resources they contained, but this authority might have been more limited, more constrained by custom and religious tradition, and perhaps council oversight, than the absolute power of Egyptian pharaohs. Gender roles in power structures remain particularly unclear. The prominence of goddess imagery and the apparent importance of women in religious ceremonies suggest women held significant authority, at least in religious contexts. Some scholars argue for matrilineal descent systems, where property and perhaps political power pass through female lines. Others point to evidence that high-ranking women held economic and administrative roles, managing workshops and overseeing textile production, and possibly even governing regions or palaces. But Linear B tablets from Mycenaean Crete, the only texts we can read, show male-dominated administration, with male names holding official positions. Whether this represents a change from earlier Minoan practice after Mycenaean takeover, or whether it simply reflects the particular functions recorded in administrative documents, while female authority operated in religious realms not captured in these texts, remains uncertain. Social hierarchy beyond the elite levels is also unclear. The palaces required labourers, farmers to work palace lands, craftspeople to staff workshops, servants to maintain buildings and prepare food. Were these people free citizens, perhaps with their own small farms or workshops, providing labour as tax obligation? Or were some of them slaves, captured in raids or born into servitude? The evidence allows for both possibilities, and likely both existed to varying degrees. What seems clear is that Minoan society was stratified, with significant differences in wealth and status. Elite burials contain gold jewellery and imported luxury goods. Common burials have simple pottery and few possessions. Houses vary from large elaborate structures to simple one-room dwellings. But compared to many ancient societies, the stratification seems relatively modest. There are no vast disparities, no evidence of extreme poverty alongside extreme wealth, no massive monuments demanding thousands of labourers slaving under harsh conditions. Perhaps what's most remarkable about Minoan social organisation is what it lacked: the extensive military apparatus common in Bronze Age societies. There's no evidence for large standing armies, for military training facilities, for extensive weapons production beyond what's needed for hunting and ceremonial purposes. The palaces allocated resources to art and craft and religious festivals rather than fortifications and weapons. This suggests a society that achieved security through other means, perhaps naval superiority, perhaps geographic isolation, perhaps diplomatic relationships, perhaps simply fortunate timing in a relatively peaceful period. And this brings us to one of the most enduring questions about the Minoans. What can we learn from their writing? Or rather, from our inability to read it? Every time archaeologists excavate a Minoan site, there's hope that this will be the dig that finds the key to Linear A, the bilingual inscription, or extensive text that will finally allow decipherment. So far, that hope remains unfulfilled. Linear A stubbornly resists all attempts to read it, mocking researchers with its tantalizingly regular structure and frustrating opacity. We have about 1,500 Linear A documents, mostly short administrative text from palace archives. This is simultaneously a lot and not nearly enough. It's enough to identify patterns, to recognise that certain signs appear frequently in specific contexts, to understand the basic structure of the script. But it's not enough to determine the underlying language or to assign definite meanings to most signs. The relationship between Linear A and Linear B offers both hope and frustration. Linear B, which records Mycenaean Greek and which Michael Ventris brilliantly deciphered in 1952, clearly derives from Linear A. Many signs are identical or nearly so. The general structure, a syllabic script with additional logograms, is the same. This means we can make educated guesses about Linear A sign values based on their Linear B equivalents. And these educated guesses do yield results, sort of. Some Linear A words, when transliterated using Linear B sign values, produce sounds that seem meaningful. The word that appears on religious offerings and inscriptions might be read as quote to or similar, which some scholars connect to Near Eastern goddess names like Asherah or Astarte. Other words might be numbers or measures or common commodity terms. But these potential readings remain speculative, and most Linear A texts remain utterly opaque. The fundamental problem is that we don't know what language Linear A records. If it's related to Greek, then the Linear B values should help. But what if it's not Greek at all? What if it's a language isolate related to nothing else we know? Or what if it's Luwian, an Anatolian language known from later texts? Or Semitic, related to Phoenician or Hebrew? Each possibility suggests different approaches to decipherment, and without more data we cannot determine which is correct. Some scholars have proposed that Linear A records a non-Indo-European language, perhaps related to Etruscan or to hypothetical pre-Greek languages of the Aegean. This would explain why efforts to read it using approaches that work for Indo-European languages have failed. But without bilingual texts, without some clear connection to a known language, this remains speculation. The context in which Linear A appears provides some clues even if we cannot read the texts themselves. Most tablets are clearly administrative, recording quantities of goods, so many units of grain, so many jars of oil, so many sheep. The structure is formulaic, following predictable patterns: commodity sign, number, sometimes a personal name or place name. Even without reading the words, we understand the function. Some Linear A inscriptions appear on religious objects: libation vessels, offering tables, seals. These might be dedicatory inscriptions, prayers, or ritual formulas. They tend to follow different patterns than administrative texts, suggesting different linguistic registers or purposes. Understanding these religious texts might reveal something about Minoan spiritual life and beliefs, about the names and nature of their gods, about their understanding of the relationship between human and divine. There are also a few longer Linear A texts carved in stone that might represent something other than administrative records. These could be historical records, building inscriptions, even literature. But without decipherment, we cannot know. Every Linear A text remains a locked box, its contents tantalizingly present but utterly inaccessible. The situation is immensely frustrating for scholars, but perhaps oddly fitting for us, encountering the Minoans as we drift towards sleep. They remain mysterious, knowable only through the mute testimony of architecture and art and objects. Their voices are silent. Their stories are untold. We see what they built and made and valued, but their own words, their names for themselves, their understanding of their own history and identity remain locked away. Perhaps someday a discovery will change this. A bilingual inscription, a longer text with enough internal structure to allow cryptographic analysis, an archive that escaped the fires that baked most Linear A tablets into hard-baked clay. When that discovery occurs, it will transform our understanding of the Minoans, giving them voice after 3,000 years of silence. Until then, we work with what we have: the material remains, the art and architecture, the traces of daily life preserved in ruins and refuse heaps. And perhaps there's something to be learned from this silence, from the humility required to admit that despite all our technology and scholarship, we still cannot read the words these people wrote. And this brings us to consider the enduring mythological legacy of Minoan Crete. The way Greek myths preserved memories of the palaces and their culture long after the civilization itself had vanished. The myths that ancient Greeks told about Crete are strange and violent and memorable. King Minos, son of Zeus and the mortal woman Europa. His wife Pasiphae, cursed to desire a white bull. The monstrous offspring of that union, half man and half bull, the Minotaur. The labyrinth that Daedalus built to contain the monster. The tribute of Athenian youths and maidens, sent every 9 years to be devoured. Theseus, the Athenian prince who volunteered to be one of the victims. Ariadne, Minos' daughter, who fell in love with Theseus and gave him the thread that would guide him out of the labyrinth after he killed the Minotaur. These are not historical accounts. They're myths, shaped by centuries of oral transmission, elaborated and altered and interwoven with other stories until their origins became obscured. But myths often preserve kernels of historical memory, distorted by time but not entirely invented. When we look at the Minoan palaces, when we consider what we know of their civilization, we can see possible origins for elements of these myths. The labyrinth, first. The palace at Knossos is indeed labyrinthine, with hundreds of rooms. Corridors that wind and branch, stairs that ascend and descend, spaces that connect in complex and non-intuitive ways. A visitor unfamiliar with the layout could easily become lost. Perhaps the myth of the labyrinth preserves a memory of the palace itself, of how confusing and overwhelming it must have seemed to outsiders, how easy to enter but difficult to navigate, how one might feel trapped in its complexity. The bull imagery connects directly to what we know of Minoan religion. Bulls appear constantly in Minoan art. Bull leaping was clearly a significant ritual or sport. Bulls' head rhytons were used in ceremonies. The emphasis on bulls in Greek myths about Crete, not just the Minotaur but also the story of Europa, whom Zeus in the form of a bull carried to Crete, and Poseidon's white bull that Minos refused to sacrifice, leading to Pasiphae's curse, might reflect genuine Minoan religious practices that seemed strange and distinctive to later Greeks. The Minotaur itself, a human-bull hybrid, might be a mythological interpretation of Minoan religious imagery. Many cultures depict their gods with animal features or show humans wearing animal masks in rituals. Perhaps Minoan priests or ritual participants wore bullhead masks during ceremonies. Perhaps artists depicted gods or mythological figures with both human and bovine characteristics. Later Greeks, encountering these images but lacking context, might have interpreted them as depictions of an actual monster. King Minos raises interesting questions. Was there a historical ruler or dynasty behind the mythological figure? The name appears multiple times in the Linear B tablets as Minoju, which might be a title rather than a personal name, perhaps meaning something like king or ruler. Perhaps all Cretan rulers were called Minos, and later Greeks, hearing stories about the Minos, assumed it referred to a single legendary king rather than a title used across generations. The tribute of Athenian youths and maidens might preserve a memory of Minoan political dominance over Athens or other Greek cities. Perhaps Crete did once exact tribute from mainland communities, and perhaps young people were part of that tribute, sent to work in Cretan palaces or workshops. The later myth transformed this into a darker story of human sacrifice, making the Minoans into monsters in order to justify Theseus's heroism in defeating them. Ariadne is particularly interesting because she might preserve memory of Minoan goddess worship. In some versions of the myth, she's divine or semi-divine herself, associated with fertility and vegetation cults. On Naxos, where Theseus supposedly abandoned her, Ariadne had ancient cult worship. Perhaps she was originally a Minoan goddess, later humanized and incorporated into Greek mythology as a mortal princess. The story of Daedalus, the master craftsman who built the labyrinth and later fashioned wings of feathers and wax for himself, and his son Icarus, might reflect Greek awareness of Minoan technological and artistic achievement. Daedalus was said to have created works of astonishing skill, statues that seemed alive, architectural wonders, ingenious mechanisms. Perhaps this mythological figure preserves memory of Minoan craftspeople, whose skill seemed almost supernatural to their contemporaries. And the tragic ending of these myths, Icarus falling into the sea, Theseus forgetting to change his ship's sails and causing his father's suicide, Ariadne abandoned, might reflect some Greek awareness that Minoan civilization ended badly, that its glories were followed by catastrophe and decline, that its achievements ultimately couldn't prevent its fall. What's remarkable is that these myths kept the memory of Minoan Crete alive through the Greek Dark Ages. Through centuries when literacy was lost and the palaces lay in ruins, through the classical and Hellenistic and Roman periods, right down to the 19th century when Arthur Evans, inspired partly by these myths, began excavating at Knossos. The stories were powerful enough to survive 3,000 years of transmission, distorted but not erased, altered but still recognizably connected to their origins. And this persistence of memory, this refusal to let an entire civilization be forgotten, speaks to something fundamental about human nature. Our need for stories, our desire to preserve the past even in mythological form, our recognition that what came before matters, that vanished peoples and cultures deserve to be remembered. Which brings us to consider what the Minoans might have believed about time and history and meaning. What worldview animated their culture and gave structure to their understanding of existence? Trying to reconstruct the worldview of a culture whose language we cannot read, whose religious texts are inaccessible, whose myths survive only in distorted form, is necessarily speculative. But we can make educated inferences based on what they chose to depict in art, how they organised space, what they valued enough to preserve and trade and display. And from these inferences, a picture emerges of a culture with a distinctive way of understanding the world and humanity's place within it. The Minoans seem to have understood the world as fundamentally abundant and benevolent. Their art celebrates natural beauty, flowers and animals, dolphins and birds, gardens and landscapes. There's little emphasis on scarcity or suffering, little glorification of violence or domination. Even predators, when they appear, are shown as dignified and powerful rather than threatening. This suggests a fundamental optimism, a sense that the world provides, that nature is to be celebrated rather than feared or conquered. Religious imagery emphasizes female divinity and fertility. The goddess appears in multiple forms, as mistress of animals, as goddess of vegetation and growth, as protector of cities and homes. But consistently, divinity is associated with generation and nourishment and protection, rather than with judgment or wrath or demanding sacrifice. The relationship between humans and gods seems reciprocal. Offerings are made, but as gifts that maintain relationship rather than desperate bribes to appease angry powers. The Minoan approach to death, as revealed in burial practices, suggests belief in some form of afterlife without being obsessively concerned with it. Bodies were carefully buried with grave goods, but not in massive tomb complexes requiring decades of labour. The dead were provided for, but not worshipped as ancestors in ways that dominate the living. There's respect for death, but not terror of it. Preparation for whatever comes next, but not anxiety that overwhelms present life. Social relationships, to the extent we can infer them, seem less rigidly hierarchical than in many ancient societies. Yes, there were elites, people with more wealth and status and probably power, but the disparity wasn't absolute. Art doesn't emphasize domination or submission. There are no depictions of gods or kings towering over tiny subjects. When processions appear in frescoes, the figures are roughly equal in size and dignity. This suggests a worldview that saw all people as possessing inherent worth, even if they occupied different social positions. The relationship with nature was intimate and respectful. The peak sanctuaries and sacred caves show reverence for natural places, for mountains and underground spaces, for locations where the natural world seemed especially powerful or mysterious. But this wasn't primitive nature worship so much as recognition that certain places facilitate contact with the divine, that the gods are present in the landscape, that the boundary between sacred and mundane is permeable. Time seems to have been understood cyclically rather than linearly. The emphasis on agricultural festivals, on seasonal celebrations, on rituals that repeated year after year, suggests a worldview oriented around renewal and return rather than progress toward an endpoint. Each year brought the same sequence: planting and growth and harvest and rest, and then planting again. Life followed similar cycles, birth and maturity and decline and death, and then new birth continuing the pattern. This cyclical understanding doesn't preclude change or development, but frames them within larger patterns of repetition and renewal. There's something profoundly peaceful about this worldview, something that might have practical wisdom for us today. The Minoans seem to have lived without the existential terror that characterizes so much of human history, without the desperate need to build massive monuments to defeat death, without the compulsion to conquer and dominate to prove human superiority over nature. They built beautiful palaces, created extraordinary art, developed sophisticated culture, all while maintaining what seems to have been a fundamentally harmonious relationship with their island home and the natural forces that sustained them. Of course, we might be romanticising. The evidence is fragmentary, and we're seeing what survived and was preserved and was considered worthy of artistic representation. Daily life surely had its hardships and conflicts and tragedies. People suffered from disease and injury and hunger when harvests failed. There were probably social tensions and crimes and injustices that left no archaeological trace. No society is ever as perfect as its art makes it appear. But even acknowledging this, there's something distinctive about Minoan culture, something that sets it apart from the Mycenaean Greeks who followed them, or the Near Eastern civilizations that were their contemporaries. The absence of fortification walls, the lack of military glorification, the emphasis on nature and beauty and religious celebration, the apparent importance of women in positions of authority, or at least religious significance. All of this suggests a culture with different priorities, different values, a different understanding of what makes life worth living, and this brings us naturally to consider what was ultimately lost when Minoan civilization ended, what continuity survived, and what legacy the Minoans left for the cultures that followed them. When the Mycenaean Greeks came to dominate Crete, they didn't simply replace Minoan culture with their own. Cultures rarely work that way. Instead, there was synthesis, adaptation, a blending of traditions that created something neither purely Minoan nor purely Mycenaean, but a hybrid carrying elements of both. And through this Mycenaean intermediary, aspects of Minoan civilization entered the broader Greek tradition, and thus influenced all of Western culture. The most obvious inheritance is artistic. Mycenaean art shows clear Minoan influence. The marine motifs, the naturalistic rendering of animals and plants, the graceful human figures. Mycenaean palaces, though fortified unlike Minoan ones, adopted Minoan architectural features, light wells for illumination, sophisticated drainage systems, colourful frescoes on walls. The megaron, a distinctive room type in Mycenaean palaces, might derive from earlier Minoan architectural forms. Religious continuity is harder to trace but clearly present. Several deities worshipped in classical Greek religion have names that appear in Linear B tablets from Mycenaean Crete: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena. These gods might be Mycenaean imports to Crete, or they might be Minoan deities whose names the Mycenaeans adopted, or most likely, they're the result of complex syncretism where Minoan and Mycenaean religious traditions blended. The goddess worship so prominent in Minoan religion probably influenced Greek goddess cults, though disentangling what's indigenous Greek and what's borrowed from Crete is nearly impossible. Technology and craft traditions certainly transferred. Mycenaean craftspeople learned techniques from Minoan masters, or were perhaps Minoan craftspeople working under new management. The sophisticated palace administration system, recorded in Linear B tablets, clearly derives from earlier Minoan practices. The bureaucratic methods, the system of recording transactions and tracking goods, the organisation of palace economies, all show Minoan origins adapted to serve Mycenaean purposes. Maritime traditions passed from Minoans to Mycenaeans to later Greeks. The skills of shipbuilding and navigation, the knowledge of trade routes and distant markets, the network of contacts across the Mediterranean, all this was inherited and expanded. The Greeks of the classical period saw themselves as seafaring people, and this maritime identity began with the Minoans who first systematically explored and traded across the eastern Mediterranean. Certain cultural practices that defined Greek identity might have Minoan roots. The symposium, the tradition of communal drinking and entertainment that was so important in Greek social life, might descend from Minoan gathering traditions visible in some frescoes. Athletic competitions, so central to Greek culture, might relate to the bull leaping and other physical displays of Minoan ceremonies. The emphasis on physical beauty and grace, the celebration of the human body in motion, connects Minoan art with later Greek sculptural traditions. More broadly, the concept of Crete as special, as somehow different from mainland Greece, as a place of ancient wisdom and mysterious cults, pervaded Greek cultural consciousness. Crete was where Zeus was born and raised. It was the home of the legendary lawgiver Minos. It was the setting for numerous myths involving transformation and mystery and divine power. This sense of Cretan distinctiveness reflects dim Greek awareness that something remarkable had existed on the island before their own civilization developed, something that deserved remembrance even if its details were lost. The classical Greeks called earlier inhabitants of Greece, including presumably the Minoans, the Pelasgians, describing them as pre-Greek peoples who had occupied the land first. This acknowledgement of predecessors, of cultural layers beneath Greek civilization, kept alive the idea that Greek culture didn't emerge from nothing but built upon earlier achievements. When Greek philosophers and historians looked back in time, they understood their civilization had roots, had learned from others, stood on foundations laid by earlier peoples. And this brings us to a more difficult question. What aspects of Minoan culture didn't survive? What was genuinely lost when the civilization ended? What couldn't be recovered or transmitted to successor cultures? Every vanished civilization leaves absences, things that existed once but are now irretrievably gone. For the Minoans, the most obvious loss is their language. Unless Linear A is someday deciphered, we will never read their poetry, if they wrote poetry. We'll never know their myths in their own words. We'll never understand their religious texts or their history as they understood it. Every culture explains itself to itself through narratives, and those narratives, for the Minoans, are lost. Music is another profound loss. We know the Minoans had music. Lyres and flutes appear in frescoes, and later Greek sources mention Cretan musical traditions. But ancient music rarely survives because it's inherently ephemeral, transmitted through performance rather than written down. We'll never hear the songs they sang during religious ceremonies, the work songs that made labour bearable, the lullabies mothers sang to children, the funeral dirges that mourned the dead. An entire sonic landscape, the soundscape of daily Minoan life, has vanished absolutely. Scent and flavour are gone too. We know they used perfumed oils. Ceramic vessels designed for holding scented substances appear in excavations. We know they cooked and ate certain foods, but the actual tastes and smells, the sensory experiences that would have been utterly familiar to every Minoan, are gone. How did their wine taste? What herbs did they prefer in cooking? What flowers did they use in perfumes? These intimate details of daily life, so fundamental to lived experience, can't be recovered. Clothing in its full complexity has vanished. We see depictions in frescoes, but we can't know the texture of the fabrics, the weight of the cloth, how it felt to wear. The colours have long since faded from any textile fragments that survive. The patterns and decorations, the subtle variations in style that would have signified status or regional identity or personal taste are lost. Fashion, so important in any culture, is reduced to artistic representations that can't capture the full reality. Most of their literature, if they had written literature beyond administrative records, is gone. Did they have epic poems like the Iliad? Did they have wisdom literature, collections of proverbs and sayings? Did they have hymns to their gods that were artistically sophisticated, meant to be appreciated not just for religious content but for literary beauty? We have no idea because almost no texts beyond economic records survive, and those texts we have are in a script we can't read. Personal histories have vanished almost completely. We don't know the names of any Minoan rulers with certainty. We don't know the names of the artists who painted the frescoes or the architects who designed the palaces. We don't know the stories of individual lives, the romances and tragedies and triumphs that must have been passed down within families. Every person who lived in Minoan Crete, thousands upon thousands of individuals across centuries, is now anonymous, known only through the collective traces of their civilization. Scientific and technical knowledge has been lost. The Minoans clearly possessed sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering, of architecture, of metallurgy, of agricultural techniques suited to Mediterranean climate. Much of this knowledge was probably never written down but transmitted through apprenticeship and demonstration. When the civilization ended, when the chain of transmission broke, this accumulated wisdom vanished. Later cultures had to rediscover or reinvent techniques the Minoans knew well. The nuances of their social relationships, the unwritten rules that governed daily interactions, the gestures and phrases that conveyed meaning, the humour and inside jokes that made sense to them but would be opaque to outsiders, all this is gone. Culture consists as much of these intangibles as of the physical objects and architectural remains that survive. We can reconstruct Minoan buildings, but not the conversations that occurred within them, the relationships between people who inhabited those spaces, the lived experience of being Minoan. Religious experience has been reduced to material culture. We see the shrines and offering tables, the figurines and ritual vessels, but we can't know what it felt like to participate in a Minoan religious ceremony. What emotional states did their rituals induce? What sense of connection to divinity did worshippers experience? What comfort did their religion provide in times of suffering? Religion is primarily experiential, and that experience is irretrievably lost to us. The Minoan sense of identity itself is gone. How did they understand themselves? What did it mean to them to be Minoan? What stories did they tell about their origins and their distinctiveness from other peoples? Every culture has a self-understanding, a narrative about who they are and why they matter, and the Minoan version of this narrative is lost. We can never understand them quite as they understood themselves, and yet, despite all these losses, despite everything that's vanished and can never be recovered, something remains. The palaces still stand, at least partially. The frescoes still glow with colour. The pottery and seal stones and jewellery still testify to skill and aesthetic achievement. The fundamental fact of their existence, of their having created a sophisticated and distinctive civilization, endures. They're gone, but they're not entirely lost. And that partial survival, that fragmentary persistence, is itself meaningful. What can a Bronze Age civilization, separated from us by 3,000 years, possibly teach people living in an age of technology and global interconnection? More than we might initially think, perhaps. The Minoans offer not a blueprint to copy, but a reminder of alternative possibilities, of different ways of organising society and understanding the world. Their apparent lack of militarism deserves serious consideration. Every society faces security threats, yet the Minoans built palaces without fortification walls, created art that didn't glorify warfare, allocated resources to beauty and ceremony rather than military might. How did they achieve security? Perhaps through naval superiority, though we have limited evidence for Minoan fleets. Perhaps through diplomacy and trade relationships that made military conflict economically irrational. Perhaps through simple geographic isolation. But whatever the mechanism, they demonstrated that sophisticated civilization doesn't require constant preparation for war. Their relationship with nature offers another lesson. Minoan art celebrates the natural world rather than depicting its conquest or exploitation. Animals appear as worthy of respect, even reverence. Gardens and landscapes feature prominently in decorative schemes. Sacred sites were located in natural settings, mountain peaks and caves, that emphasize divine presence in the landscape. This isn't primitive nature worship, but sophisticated recognition that human flourishing depends on maintaining harmonious relationships with the environment that sustains us. The apparent gender egalitarianism, or at least the significant roles women played in Minoan society, challenges assumptions about inevitable patriarchal structures in complex civilizations. Women appear prominently in religious art, possibly held political power, certainly managed important economic functions. Whether this constitutes true gender equality is debatable with limited evidence, but it demonstrates that Bronze Age societies could organise themselves with different gender relationships than those that came to dominate much of later European history. Their emphasis on beauty and artistic achievement, on making even utilitarian objects aesthetically pleasing, suggests a culture that understood the importance of daily aesthetic experience. Not just grand monuments, but pottery and seal stones and jewellery were crafted with attention to beauty. Public spaces were decorated with frescoes. Architecture integrated artistry and function. There's wisdom in this, in recognising that human beings need beauty, that environments that delight the senses contribute to flourishing in ways that purely functional spaces cannot. The cyclical worldview, the emphasis on seasonal renewal rather than linear progress, might offer useful counterbalance to modern obsessions with endless growth and development. The Minoans understood that some things recur, that patterns repeat, that sustainable cultures work with natural cycles rather than attempting to transcend or defeat them. This isn't an argument against progress, but a reminder that not all change is improvement, that some traditional patterns persist because they work. Their apparent comfort with mystery and uncertainty, visible in their religious practices and their relationship with the natural world, contrast with modern insistence on complete explanation and control. The Minoans worshipped at peak sanctuaries and sacred caves, places where human habitation gave way to wilderness, where the boundary between known and unknown became permeable. They seemed to have been comfortable with questions that couldn't be fully answered, with powers that couldn't be entirely controlled, with accepting limitation. The integration of religious and daily life, the apparent lack of sharp boundaries between sacred and secular realms, suggests a more holistic understanding of existence. Religious ceremonies weren't separate from ordinary life, but emerged from and returned to it. Work and celebration and worship interwove rather than occupying separate compartments. There's psychological wisdom in this integration, in not fragmenting life into disconnected spheres, but understanding all of it as unified. Their resilience in the face of natural disasters demonstrates important cultural strengths. Earthquakes destroyed their palaces repeatedly, and repeatedly they rebuilt, often more elaborately than before. This wasn't stubborn refusal to acknowledge danger, but mature understanding that catastrophe is part of existence, that recovery is possible, that communities can endure and rebuild after devastating losses. In an age of climate change and increasing natural disasters, this resilience deserves attention. The value they placed on craft and skilled work, visible in the extraordinary quality of even small objects, reminds us that there's dignity in making things well. Minoan craftspeople took pride in their work, created objects that transcended mere function to achieve beauty. In an age of mass production and disposability, the Minoan example suggests the worth of craftsmanship, of developing skills deeply, of creating things meant to last and delight. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Minoans demonstrate that there's no single way to build civilization. The path they followed differed from Egypt or Mesopotamia or China or Mesoamerica. They made different choices, developed different priorities, created something distinctive. This diversity of human civilizational forms is itself valuable, reminding us that the particular arrangements we're familiar with aren't inevitable or universal, but choices that could have been made differently. And this brings us to consider why we still care about the Minoans, why they continue to fascinate people who encounter them, what it is about this vanished civilization that resonates across the millennia. There's something haunting about the Minoans, something that captures imagination in ways that many other ancient civilizations don't quite manage. Part of this is aesthetic. The frescoes are genuinely beautiful, immediately appealing to modern sensibilities in ways that more austere or monumental ancient art sometimes isn't. But there's more to it than prettiness. There's mystery, there's lost knowledge, there's the sense of something valuable that was destroyed before it could fully develop. The Minoans occupy a unique temporal and cultural position. They're the first European civilization, the earliest complex society north of the Mediterranean, the beginning of a tradition that would eventually lead through Greece and Rome to modern Western culture. Understanding the Minoans means understanding our own deep past, the roots from which, however indirectly, our own civilization grew. They're us, in a sense. or at least our cultural ancestors, even if the connection is obscured by millennia and multiple cultural transformations. But they're also genuinely foreign, genuinely other. Their language is unreadable, their religion is only partially understood, their social structures remain debated. Despite being ancestors, they're also strangers, separated from us by gulfs we cannot entirely bridge. This combination of familiarity and foreignness creates a productive tension, inviting engagement while resisting complete comprehension. The peaceful character of Minoan society, or at least its apparent lack of militarism, appeals to modern sensibilities shaped by wars and violence. We want to believe that sophisticated civilization doesn't require constant conflict, that human societies can organize themselves around beauty and celebration rather than domination and conquest. Whether this reading of Minoan society is entirely accurate or partly wishful thinking, it serves a psychological need, providing an historical example that suggests alternatives to violence. The mysterious decline adds to the fascination. The Minoans were at their height, then relatively quickly they were gone, absorbed into Mycenaean culture, their palaces destroyed, their distinctive character lost. There's tragedy in this, the sense of something beautiful being destroyed before its time. Unlike civilizations that gradually faded or were slowly absorbed into successor cultures, the Minoan ending feels abrupt, catastrophic, final. And humans have always been drawn to stories of catastrophe, especially when they involve the loss of something valuable. The Undeciphered script maintains active mystery. As long as Linear A remains unread, there's always the possibility of dramatic revelation, of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Every archaeological expedition to Crete carries the hope that this might be the dig that finds the bilingual text, the extensive archive, the key that unlocks everything. This ongoing mystery keeps the Minoans relevant in ways that completely understood ancient cultures sometimes aren't. The artistic achievement remains impressive even by modern standards. Minoan frescoes hold their own against any ancient art tradition. The architecture remains elegant and sophisticated. The craftsmanship in pottery and seal stones and metalwork shows technical skill and aesthetic sensibility that transcends temporal distance. Beauty endures, and the Minoans created beauty that still moves people 35 centuries later. There's also something appealing about their scale. Minoan civilization was significant but not overwhelming. It didn't dominate half the known world like Rome or the Persian Empire. It didn't build pyramids or massive monuments requiring the labour of thousands. It was human-scaled, comprehensible, the kind of civilization where individual achievement mattered, where one person's skill or vision could tangibly contribute to the cultural whole. This makes the Minoans feel more accessible, more relatable than some of the vast empires of antiquity. The connection to Greek mythology adds another layer of interest. The stories of King Minos and the Minotaur and Ariadne and Daedalus are part of Western cultural literacy. Encountering the actual civilization that inspired these myths, seeing the physical reality behind the stories, creates a satisfying sense of connection between myth and history, literature and archaeology. The Minoans also benefit from excellent archaeological preservation and presentation. The site at Knossos, despite controversies over Evans's reconstructions, gives visitors a visceral sense of the palace in ways that most ancient ruins don't. You can walk through corridors, see painted walls, understand the spatial relationships. This physical accessibility makes the Minoans feel real in ways that civilizations known only through excavated foundations and scattered artifacts sometimes don't. There's also timing. The Minoans were rediscovered at a moment when European culture was ready to appreciate them. Evans's excavations occurred in the early 20th century, when modernist art movements were experimenting with forms and colours that paralleled aspects of Minoan aesthetics. The naturalism and grace of Minoan art appealed to sensibilities shaped by Art Nouveau and later Art Deco. The Minoans entered modern consciousness at a moment when they could be fully appreciated. Perhaps most deeply, the Minoans matter because they demonstrate the contingency of history. Civilizations rise and fall. What seems permanent and powerful can vanish with shocking rapidity. Success doesn't guarantee survival. Beauty doesn't protect against catastrophe. This is simultaneously sobering and oddly comforting. Sobering because it reminds us that our own civilization is not invulnerable, that everything we value could be lost. Comforting because it suggests that even complete catastrophe doesn't erase everything, that something survives, that memory persists, that what mattered once continues to matter. And this brings us finally to consider what remains, what survives of the Minoans today, both physically in ruins and museums, and also less tangibly in continued influence and meaning. If you travel to Crete today, the Minoans are everywhere and nowhere. Their palaces are tourist attractions carefully maintained. Explained with informative plaques, visited by thousands of people each year who wander through ruins trying to imagine the civilization that built them. But these are ruins, reconstructed and interpreted, no longer living spaces but archaeological sites, museums under the sky. Knossos remains the most visited, partly because of its size and preservation, partly because of Evans's controversial but visually striking reconstructions. The red columns and painted walls, even if they're modern recreations based on archaeological evidence, give visitors a sense of the palace's original appearance that bare ruins couldn't provide. You can stand in the central courtyard and understand its scale, walk through the maze of rooms and comprehend why Greeks might have imagined a labyrinth. See the throne room and imagine ceremonies that occurred there 3,000 years ago. The museums of Crete hold the accumulated treasures of a century of archaeology. In the Heraklion Archaeological Museum, you can see the original frescoes, the prints of the lilies, the dolphins, the bull-leaping scenes, carefully removed from palace walls and preserved under glass. You can examine pottery vessels painted with octopi and nautili, their tentacles flowing across the curved surfaces in designs of remarkable grace. You can see seal stones whose tiny engraved scenes are miniature masterpieces. You can examine bronze tools and weapons, gold jewellery, stone vessels so finely made they seem impossible. Academic research continues. New excavations reveal previously unknown sites. Scientific techniques allow more precise dating, more detailed analysis of ancient materials. Scholars debate interpretations, propose new theories about social organisation and religious practice, and the causes of collapse. The Minoans remain an active field of study, generating conferences and journals and books, occupying the professional lives of archaeologists and historians who dedicate careers to understanding this vanished culture. In popular culture, the Minoans appear periodically. Novels set in ancient Crete imagine the lives of palace dwellers. Games use Minoan architecture as settings. The aesthetic, those frescoes, those columns, those graceful human figures, influences designers and artists. The bull-leaping imagery appears in everything from corporate logos to album covers. The Minoans have become part of the visual vocabulary of Western culture. Shorthand for ancient sophistication and Mediterranean mystery. But beyond these concrete survivals, something more intangible remains. The idea of the Minoans, the knowledge that such a civilization existed, continues to influence how we think about history and culture and civilization. They demonstrated that Europe has deep roots, that sophisticated culture existed on the continent thousands of years before classical Athens or imperial Rome. They proved that the archaeological record can yield unexpected discoveries, that vanished civilizations can be resurrected through careful excavation and interpretation. The example of their different choices, the lack of fortifications, the emphasis on beauty, the apparent prominence of goddess worship, provides alternatives to the militaristic, patriarchal, conquest-oriented models that dominated much of ancient Mediterranean civilization. Whether or not we romanticize them, whether or not our interpretations are entirely accurate, the Minoans serve as useful counterexample, reminder that human societies can organize themselves in diverse ways. The mystery maintains interest. As long as Linear A remains undeciphered, as long as questions about their social organisation remain unresolved. As long as the causes of their decline generate scholarly debate, the Minoans will continue to attract attention. Solved mysteries become simple facts. Unsolved mysteries invite continued engagement, further research, new interpretations. For the people who live on Crete today, the Minoan heritage is complex. It's a source of pride, evidence of the island's historical importance, a draw for tourism that supports the economy. But it's also ancient, separated from contemporary Cretan culture by millennia and multiple cultural transformations. Modern Cretans speak Greek, not the Minoan language. They're Christians, not worshippers of ancient goddesses. They're part of modern Greece and European Union, connected to global networks that the Minoans never imagined. The Minoan past is theirs, but also belongs to everyone, part of human heritage rather than exclusive possession. The physical landscape of Crete still bears traces of Minoan presence. Not just the obvious palace sites, but hundreds of smaller locations, cave sanctuaries, peak sanctuaries, village sites, harbours, roads. The patterns of settlement and land use that the Minoans established influenced every subsequent culture that lived on the island. They cleared land for agriculture that remained farmland for thousands of years. They established trade relationships that persisted through cultural transformations. They understood the island's geography in ways that informed all later use of the land. And there's something almost spiritual in visiting these sites, in standing where Minoans stood, seeing landscapes they saw, touching stones they touched. It creates connection across time, makes history feel present and immediate rather than abstract and distant. This experiential dimension of archaeological sites, the way they allow direct encounter with the past, ensures that the Minoans remain relevant beyond academic interest. As long as people visit Crete, walk through palace ruins, imagine the lives of those who built them, the Minoans endure. Perhaps ultimately what remains is simply awareness, the knowledge that they existed, that they achieved what they achieved, that they were and then were not. In a universe where everything eventually passes away, where all human accomplishments are temporary, that survival in memory, even for 35 centuries, even in fragmentary form, even understood imperfectly, represents a kind of victory. The Minoans lost everything, their language, their palaces, their culture, their very identity. But they weren't erased. We remember them. And in that remembering they continue to exist in the only way the dead can, as stories, as inspiration, as reminders of human possibility and human fragility, as beautiful ruins and mysterious scripts and compelling questions that remain worth asking, even when complete answers remain beyond reach. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey. These 2.5 hours we've spent together walking through palace corridors and examining frescoes and contemplating the lives of people who lived and died 3,000 years ago. It's been a considerable journey, and I'm grateful you took it with me tonight. We've travelled far, from the first Neolithic farmers who settled on Crete 7,000 years ago, through the rise of the palaces around 2000 BCE, through the flourishing of Minoan civilization in all its artistic achievement and religious complexity, through catastrophic eruptions and earthquakes, and the eventual transformation into something else when the Mycenaeans came. We've considered daily life and sacred practices. We've stood before undeciphered scripts and mysterious rituals. We've walked through ruins that once held thousands of lives. From the central courtyard at Knossos to the peak sanctuaries on mountain summits, from the storage magazines filled with olive oil to the workshops where craftspeople created objects of remarkable beauty. We've tried to understand these people, to see the world as they might have seen it. The question I asked at the beginning, the one I've been circling throughout, is what the Minoans can teach us today. What value there is in studying a vanished civilization that left behind beautiful ruins and unsolvable mysteries. The answer, as honestly as I can give it, is that they remind us that human civilization takes many forms, that the particular arrangements we're familiar with aren't inevitable or universal, that beauty matters, that relationship with nature matters, that societies can make different choices about violence and gender and power and still achieve sophistication and success. Whether they achieve these things as completely as their art suggests, whether our interpretations are entirely accurate, almost doesn't matter. The example exists, the possibility has been demonstrated, the reminder persists that alternatives exist to assumptions we might otherwise accept as universal and unchangeable. If you found something valuable in this slow drift through Minoan history, if you enjoyed this calm exploration of ancient Crete, a like and subscribe truly helps reach others who seek the same peaceful way to end their day. You might leave a comment about which aspect of Minoan civilization fascinated you most, or suggest other lost civilizations you'd like explored in this same measured, contemplative way. And to those already subscribed, to those who return to these long meditations on vanished worlds, thank you. Your presence makes this worthwhile, knowing that someone out there listens as I talk about things that mattered long ago and that somehow still matter today. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever corner of the globe you're listening from, I hope you're comfortable. I hope your breathing has slowed from its daytime pace. I hope your thoughts have quieted, that the concerns and anxieties and to-do lists that fill the day have receded, that there's a space of calm where you can simply rest. I hope your body feels heavy, your muscles released from tension, your eyes ready to close if they haven't already. Look up at the stars if you can, if you're somewhere that darkness allows them to be visible. Those same stars shone above the palaces of Knossos, watched over priestesses climbing mountain paths to peak sanctuaries, provided navigation points for Minoan sailors crossing the Mediterranean. The Minoans are gone, their language lost, their palaces ruined, their civilization ended. But the stars remain. The landscape of Crete endures. Mountains and valleys and coastlines that have been there through all human history and will remain long after we too have passed. The olive trees that grow on Cretan hillsides descend from trees that might have stood there when Minoan farmers tended their groves. The sea that surrounds the island breaks against the same shores where Minoan ships once anchored. There's comfort in that continuity, in the knowledge that some things endure even while everything human passes. The Minoans made their mark, created beauty that lasted, built structures that stood for centuries and whose ruins stand still. They lived fully, celebrated joyfully, worshipped sincerely, created meaning in their brief time on Earth. And then they were gone, as all of us will be, as all civilizations eventually are. But they lived. That matters. Their beauty and achievement and the questions they raise matter. Memory matters. The fact that we can, 35 centuries later, reconstruct something of their existence, learn from them, be moved by their art, matters. So sleep well tonight. Rest deeply. Let go of whatever you need to let go of. The Minoans understood that life cycles through seasons, that rest is as necessary as work, that darkness is not to be feared but embraced as the time when the soul renews itself. Let their example of grace and beauty and living fully in the present moment inform your own rest, your own renewal, your own readiness to face another day tomorrow. Good night. Dream, if you dream, of painted dolphins swimming in endless seas, of flowers blooming in palace gardens, of mountains touched by morning light, of a time when people built beautiful things and lived among them, and found meaning in the cycles of seasons and the rhythms of life. Good night.